Which of the four Gospels was written first, and why does it matter? Dr. William Varner from Masters University will answer these questions and more on this edition of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. I am pleased to have Dallas Theological Seminary as a sponsor of this podcast. Here at DTS, we offer flexible programs online, on campus, and at our teaching sites around the world, with 19 unique degree programs, including doctorates, master's degrees, and certificate programs. We have something for everyone. To learn more about how you can study at Dallas Theological Seminary, please visit dts.edu. Well, I have the wonderful privilege each week of leading conversations with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors, and this week is no exception. I am pleased to have Dr. William Varner back on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. Dr. Varner's title is Professor of Biblical Languages and Bible Exposition at the Masters University. He earned a bachelor's degree from Bob Jones University, a Master of Arts degree from Dropsy College, a Master of Divinity and Master of Theology degrees from Biblical Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Education from Temple University. He has also served as a pastor, as the director of the Institute of Biblical Studies with the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, and at one point he was also the director of the Israel Bible Extension Program for 22 years. He has made over 50 trips to the Holy Land and has authored 20 books and over 100 journal and magazine articles. His most recent book, a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, is set to be released this summer. The release of the commentary is what prompted this discussion. Dr. Varner, welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
It is always good to be with you, Paul. It really is.
Well, I am looking forward to this conversation today. Dr. Varner, would you share with our listeners a little bit more about yourself regarding your extensive interest in the Gospels and this subject, Matthew specifically, but the Gospels, the land of the Bible? Tell us a little bit more.
Good. Yeah, I'm happy to. I just turned 78, brother, and been in the classroom now, well over 40 years, and teaching the life of the Messiah, the life of Christ, and wrestling with particularly Jewish backgrounds for the life of the Messiah. And having taught that, for many, many years, I was aware of the issue of which gospel is first, second, third, and fourth, but it didn't concern me as much as it has since I have written this commentary on Matthew. When in writing the commentary on Matthew and in writing the introductory chapters, I said, I want to look at this idea of Markan priority, that Mark was written first, or Matthean priority, that Matthew was written first. And having restudied it, I want to admit that I'm not sure I was that strong on Markan priority before, but it was what I was exposed to. But the more I looked at it, the more I concluded, wait a minute here. There's tremendous evidence that Matthew was written first instead of Mark. So I took it upon myself a project to rethink this. And I came to the conclusion, Paul, that Matthew was written first, and there's good evidence for that. What concerned me is the poor evidence for Markan priority. And so the commentary on Matthew is with the publisher now. I want to say that I'm not going to die on this hill. And I will be honest with you there. I advocate Matthean priority, and I think there's solid reasons for it. But I realize that there's a number of my evangelical brothers who are scholars who hold to Markan priority. So as I said, I'm not going to die on this hill, but I do think it is important for not only laymen, but scholars to look at this issue and see whether what we have been taught, oftentimes in seminary, needs to be rethought. And that's my pilgrimage here, Paul, in coming to Matthean priority.
Both of our institutions, I imagine we have colleagues that hold to Mark priority. I definitely in my department have several that hold to Matthew priority. You have a common friend who's now with the Lord. We mentioned Harold Honer, was Matthew priority. And then next week, looks like I'm going to have David Black on the podcast to discuss a little bit more on this. So
wonderful.
I'm glad to build upon. So what you're telling us today, we're going to build upon that and give his theory related to the synoptic
Wonderful.
problem.
I've been blessed and helped by David Black's Why Four Gospels. It's been very helpful to me in my study. Yeah. And also, he has written a wonderful endorsement for our Matthew commentary.
Oh, did he? Okay, good. Yeah. And when is it set to be printed?
I would say August, September is when the first issues should arise.
And your extensive interest in the land of the Bible and studies of you were part of the Friends of Israel for many years, and interest in Jewish studies has been a part of this book, right?
Very much so, and that's what I think is my love affair with the Gospel of Matthew, because it is so thoroughly Jewish in its orientation.
Yeah. And as dispensationalists, we certainly love the Gospel of Matthew because it seems to give us the clearest understanding of the offering of the kingdom, the rejection of it, and its future literal application. And Christ's going to return and establish the kingdom. We look forward to that day.
Amen.
Well, as you know, and as we've alluded to already, the dominant view in academia today is what we call a Markan priority. That is that the Gospel of Mark was written first of the four Gospels. Now, that's probably not the dominant view in the local church, but it is the dominant view in academia. What causes you to push back against the majority of scholars suggesting you, and I agree, Matthew's Gospel, we think, was written first? Why the pushback?
Yeah, let me just speak, first of all, generally. Yes, it is the majority view, but only since the early 1800s. Universally, prior to that, from the early church on, it was viewed that Matthew was the first gospel to be written. And that goes right to the apostolic fathers, Irenaeus and others in the 2nd century, going right through Augustine and then right through the Middle Ages, going right through the Protestant Reformation. And let me tell you, these were scholars, Protestant scholars of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, universally held to Matthean priority. And then coming out of Germany, and I'm not going to say it's guilt by association, but you must know that it arose from a higher critical view of Scripture. Even evangelical scholars today must admit that. There were a few German evangelical scholars that pushed back on that, and it caught the attention of American and British scholars. It was adopted, but not adopted without opposition. And it is the excellent works that were written in the late 19th and 20th and 21st centuries that, hey, listen, before we jump on this bandwagon, how about this and how about that? Now, it doesn't prove it because the early church could be wrong. I admit that. But a uniform view from the 2nd century right through into the early 19th century before it was taken over by Markan priority, that ought not to be ignored. And it wasn't just tradition. There were reasons given for that. And so that was one of the things that shook me. And then I discovered David Black and Griesbach and a number of other scholars, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, that made some very strong arguments for Matthean priority. So it may be on the rebound, I don't know, but in my small way, I'm going to contribute by saying, hey, let's don't just join this bandwagon without looking at the other evidence. And the big evidence is, why was it the dominant view? I mean, not only dominant, the exclusive view until Germans proposed it in the 19th century.
Church can be wrong, right? It's possible for the church to be wrong, but if something is true, we would expect the early generations, the early apostolic fathers, to be it to be found somewhere, right? And the fact that there's so much evidence, it's chronological snobbery, what C.S. Lewis calls the idea that we have arrived and generations before us had no clue before us.
Yeah, it's not only dominant, it was universal that Matthew wrote first. Now, again, particularly we as evangelicals, we don't exalt tradition as infallible. I'm fully aware of that. The church fathers could be wrong, but we're not talking about medieval fathers. We're talking about those who lived within a generation or two of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Irenaeus and Polycarp and also Papias knew the disciples of the apostles. Were they wrong in communicating what the disciples of the apostles believed the apostles taught? Well, I guess they could be, but I like to say this, brother. J. Gresham Machen. I did not know J. Gresham Machen, but at Princeton Seminary and Westminster Seminary in the 20s and 30s. But I had a prof in seminary who not only sat, can you believe, in the classroom of J. Gresham Machen, but went into his study and so forth and so on. And so could he have heard Machen wrong? I guess he could have. But to talk to somebody who heard J. Gresham Machen say this in the 20s and 30s, well, I better listen to what he has to say rather than depend on somebody 3 generations later and said, oh, Machen said this. So I like to use that as an illustration. So he took me into J. Gresham Machen's classroom in the 1920s and 30s. And that was probably reliable. Yes. So I like to say the same thing about the 2nd century church fathers.
You mentioned higher criticism. Could you briefly define that or describe it for our audience?
Yeah. When they say Mark was prior and Matthew was later, many of the German higher critics don't believe in Matthean authorship, much less Matthean priority, and the gospel attributed to Matthew, or they will say the gospel attributed to Mark. They aren't even sure that Mark wrote it. Whoever wrote it, it was prior to whoever wrote Matthew. So that's the difference, German and other higher critics. Now, I do have evangelical brothers who do believe that Matthew wrote it, but when we say higher critics, they say whoever wrote Matthew, it was later than whoever wrote Mark. That's the essence of higher criticism, denying the traditional and we believe accurate authorship of biblical books, attributing it to later authors. And that would be true in the Old Testament with the authorship of the Pentateuch. That's higher criticism. And I don't want to accept their conclusions without thinking it through very thoroughly.
And they would be coming from a anti-supernaturalist perspective,
Absolutely.
Trying to explain things humanistically and naturally. Only what they can conceive of could happen, and therefore there must be these mutual dependence upon different sources, especially if they're not eyewitnesses.
Matthew borrowed this, or excuse me, whoever wrote Matthew borrowed this from whoever wrote Mark. And there's no inspiration, no guidance of the Holy Spirit involved at all in higher criticism.
The last time that you were on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, we were discussing a previous book of yours on the Apostolic Fathers. And so you already alluded to this already a little bit. The Apostolic Fathers and early church fathers are important to this conversation. Anything more you'd like to say about the weight we should give to these early witnesses?
Yeah, let's take an example, Papias. Not only have I written a book on the Apostolic Fathers, but recently, Paul, I finished a chapter on Papias that's going to be in a much larger book on the Apostolic Fathers to be published by Zondervan, and it will be published in the fall. And I contributed the chapter on Papias. Papias, we do not have his writings, but we have him quoted by primarily Irenaeus and Eusebius. Maybe someday in some dark, dusty corner of an Orthodox library, they'll discover Papias's writings. But until then, we're dependent on how Eusebius and Irenaeus quote him. Well, he says that Mark really was with Peter in Rome, and in listening to Peter, he wrote down Peter's views. And that is pretty much widely accepted, and I do not deny that. I think Papias can be trusted in that regard. Now, Papias is often used, and here's where I want to step in and say, no, don't, by saying, well, Papias wrote that Mark wrote this first and then Matthew. He does not say that. There are no temporal words. He simply compares what Mark wrote and what Matthew wrote. But because he says, he mentions Matthew after Mark, people have concluded that Papias believed that Mark was written first. But if you look at what survives in Eusebius, it doesn't really say that. He's just comparing the two. And believe me, I've looked and looked and looked at it even before I was trying to think about Matthean priority. So I think that too much has been made of Papias. I think he's probably reliable in saying that Mark was Peter's gospel. Matthew, I think, was Matthew's gospel. We might even say Luke was Paul's gospel. Of course, John was John's gospel. One of the weaknesses, I think, of the Matthean, of the Markan view, Matthew was an eyewitness.
That's right.
Now, why is an eyewitness depending on Mark, who was not an eyewitness? Everybody agrees Mark was, he's not mentioned in the Gospels. There's no evidence that he was an eyewitness of Jesus. Why would Matthew, an eyewitness, depend on Mark, who was not an eyewitness? And why would Matthew wait over 30 years after Mark wrote his gospel? Because everybody agrees, I think even evangelicals would agree that Mark was written in the 60s if he followed Peter. Why would Matthew say 30, 32, whenever the crucifixion and resurrection was? Why would he wait over 30 years to write? And why would he say, okay, I'm going to use Mark, even though I was an eyewitness? So it raises a lot of problems like that. But if we see, and I can't prove this, that Matthew wrote within the first decade or maybe the first 2 decades following the death and resurrection of Jesus, it makes sense. It's the more Jewish gospel. It's a wonderful hinge between the Old and the New Testament. It's thoroughly Jewish. It does mention the Gentiles because even Jesus mentions the Gentiles, but there's no record of Gentile conversions or anything like that. So the very Jewish gospel, it makes sense that he would be the first one, particularly if our friend David Black suggests that Matthew was written in the first 15 years when the gospel was still in Jerusalem and in the immediate area. As the gospel went out to more Gentile areas, then it could be that Luke, writing more for Gentiles, contributed his gospel, and then Mark, his gospel in the 60s as he's listening to Peter. That's a big picture, but I think it makes sense.
So let's talk about Papias a little bit more. He mentions that Matthew wrote in the Hebrew dialect. What do you believe he meant? And how does that influence our understanding of the origins of the Gospels?
Yeah, here's a place where I think evangelicals, whatever their convictions about Matthew and Mark are, can disagree. It's the word dialecto in the dative. He wrote in a Hebrew dialecto. Now, he doesn't say glossa. Glossa is tongue or language. Yeah. Dialectos can be language, but it can also be, well, you look at the English word that comes from it, dialect. And there's plenty of evidence in ancient Greek literature that dialectos can also mean a way of speaking rather than a language. I personally think that that's what Papias is saying, that Matthew wrote this in a Hebrew way of constructing it, a Hebrew way of speaking, and that would certainly undergird the Jewish context of the Gospel of Matthew. So I personally think that, and here's why I'm a little bit hesitant to say that Matthew first wrote it in the Hebrew language. Why hasn't it survived? Why hasn't it survived? It has not survived. And I guess it could have disappeared. But the fact that it has not survived, I think, is an argument against its very existence. That perhaps what he was saying there, he did not write it in the Hebrew language, but he wrote it in a Hebrew dialect. It's very interesting. Wherever Hebraeidi dialecto, Hebrew dialect or language, appears in the New Testament, it always has the article in front of it, which says the Hebrew dialect or the Hebrew language. But in Papias, there's no article in front of it. And I think that's an interesting point. So he wrote not in the Hebrew dialect, he wrote it in a Hebrew dialect. In other words, in a Hebrew way of speaking. And everybody recognizes, the Hebrew context of Matthew. Many have seen that Jesus is the new Moses, and there's the 5 discourses answering to the 5 books of the Pentateuch, and that's nothing new. Scholars have recognized that Hebrew way of speaking that Matthew wrote his gospel in.
And certainly it is Jewish from beginning to end, right? The Jewish genealogy of going back to Abraham, all of the Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled. This fulfills that. Those of us that aren't mutual dependence theorists see that they are 4 different authors writing to 4 different audiences with different interests. From a Jewish audience has certain interests that are different than a Roman audience and a Gentile or Greek audience, Theophilus, or a general audience like John's Gospel.
Yeah. Well, there was a German, not a Markan priorist, named Griesbach, who suggested the 2 gospel hypothesis. Let me just say that a little bit there's a little confusion about that word 2. 2 gospel hypothesis means Matthew and Luke came and then Mark, afterwards. But there's a 2 source hypothesis, yes, and they shouldn't be confused. True. And so our listeners need to know that the 2 gospel hypothesis is Matthew and Luke came first, but the 2 source hypothesis is in front of Matthew and Luke was the Gospel of Mark and an imaginary document called the Q document, from the German word Quelle, which means source. And so this
very original word, right? Source for the source.
Right. Q. Absolutely. Quelle. Yeah. So the 2 source, and this idea, which is dominant, sadly, even among some of my evangelical brothers, is that Matthew and Luke used Mark, and because Mark is mostly action, where did they come up with all of these sayings that are in Matthew and Luke? Well, they came up with it because they had Mark here and then this Quelle document, this source document, which was a sayings gospel. And so Matthew takes what Mark said and then adds some of the sources, oral sources, and puts together the Gospel of Matthew as well as Luke putting together the Gospel of Luke. So that's the 2 source hypothesis. That's not the same as the 2 gospel hypothesis, which is Matthew and Luke, and then came Mark.
So the Griesbach hypothesis is that Matthew and Luke came first, then Mark after that.
Yes. And Matthean priorists are not committed to that. There are good brothers, some of them who used to teach at the Master's Seminary, who believe in the Augustinian 4 gospel hypothesis, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and it's not that they used each other. I see nothing wrong with the Griesbach hypothesis, but there are others who believe, no, they're all 4 separate. They didn't borrow from each other, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in that chronology. I just am going to say that Matthew was first.
Sure.
And I'm not going to die on that hill, but I'm going to argue for it. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So we're getting into the waters of mutual dependence theories and the synoptic problem and what sources are being used, if there are any sources, and I think it's Charles Dyer that in his journal article that's in the BibSac the Dallas Seminary's journal, he said, any hypothesis that has only theoretical sources should be immediately suspect. That was his statement.
So let's throw Q document away because it's hypothetical. But I guess they had to come up with it. The Germans, that is, they had to come up with it. Well, of course, they all knew about the events, but where did they come up with these sayings? Well, they must have come up with some document that embodies the sayings. And that's I call it mythical Q document.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have no evidence, no manuscripts whatsoever of this supposed Q source.
No.
But this theory of the Q source came up because we're coming from Enlightenment thinking people that don't believe the Bible's inspired, don't believe it's without error. And like you said, they're not first century eyewitnesses. So how could they be recording miracles that performed in all three, 2 or 3 of them recording the same miracles if they don't believe miracles can happen? Well, they must be depending on a common made up story, right?
Yes. And I think also we need to look at a larger picture here. And this is going to make some folks mad at me. Coming out of Germany, okay, I can't help but think that there's an overarching thinking of simple to complex, shorter to larger. Mm-hmm. That's that evolutionary development. So that I think may appeal to those who are committed to an evolutionary development, that the simple, shortest sayings and gospel came first, and then it developed, and I know it's going to make some people mad at me. But I think that there may be something there coming out of Germany, simple to complex, evolutionary, simple, more complex, Mark simple, Matthew more complex. I hope it's not that, but I can't help but think that may be influencing some, at least of the German thinkers. And we today maybe have adopting that without realizing what we're doing. We oftentimes say Mark is shorter. But like in Matthew 15 and Mark 7, you've got an almost identical passage where there's this question about washing hands. Yeah. And Matthew does not explain the custom, but Mark does this. He explains that, and he says, thus declaring all foods clean. And all of us recognize that statement, which is not in Matthew, but is in Mark, is an editorial comment by Mark. And I agree with it. I believe it's true that Jesus' statement, it's not that which comes out of the physical, but that which spiritual, which is the most important. Thus he declared all foods clean. To me, Paul, that sounds like an editorial comment later on an earlier gospel event that's recorded in Matthew, and Mark also records it, but adds that. I think that's a perfect example of later editorial comments on Matthew. And I'm not saying he was wrong in doing it, but he's saying, now I want you to know that Jesus did that to make all foods clean. And I agree with that. But that seems like a later comment rather than an earlier comment. And why would Matthew leave it out?
Yeah. Mark's gospel has about 93% of the material is also found in another one of the gospels in the synoptics, yes. Matthew and Luke. And so, of course, that's one of the reasons, as you're saying, the thought is simple to greater, to that Matthew and Luke would have added content taken. But you make a good point. And in my study and teaching of the gospels, it's very clear that Mark had a lot of details although it has the least amount of material, it's the smallest of the Gospels. When it does have an account that's found in Matthew and Luke as well, it has specific details that aren't found in the other, like Jesus is laying on a pillow in the boat, right? So details that if Matthew and Luke were pulling from, you would think they would also include that and add more, not leave out some of the details that Mark includes.
Well put. So yes, Mark is a shorter gospel, but it's surprising I think the inspired editorial comments that he makes that are not in Matthew. Yeah.
I taught a Life of Christ course last year at my church, and I would use Matthew as my base for the synoptics, but then I'd go to Mark and say, see, this detail, Mark gives us more information here and Luke here, but so it's not just a copying and pasting for sure, even if you are a Mark priority, right? Do you feel like there's any essential dependence between the different documents, or do you feel like they are all four eyewitnesses writing the same events?
Very good question. Luke shows knowledge that people had made an effort to record things about Jesus. Oh, how I wish that Luke had said, oh, yes, that's the Gospel of Matthew, or, oh, yes, that's the Gospel of Mark. He doesn't. But
he says many others.
Yes. So there were others. As evangelicals, I think we take resting in the fact that which has survived is that which God wanted us to see, that which was inspired. And again, I want to emphasize, in case there's a layman out there who doesn't think that I think highly of Mark, I do. I just don't think he was first. Now, here's what I find perplexing, Paul, in reading an evangelical Markan priority commentary. Oftentimes, they end up simply commenting on what Matthew says. But they precede it by saying, now Matthew got this from Mark, and he got the following in the passage from Q. And then they finish that, and then they comment on the Matthew text. And oftentimes it's good. It's just, why do we feel like we have to see Matthew's job as infinitely more important than an editor who's cutting and pasting from previous documents? Again, that's a harsh comment on my part, and I know that some people will be upset with me, but I just see Matthew as more than a cut and paste editor. But in many commentaries that I can benefit from, once they finally start commenting on the text of Matthew or Luke, they're good. But they have to posit, propose an idea that Matthew got this from Mark and from Q. That's my concern.
Yeah. And in my Gospels course, I share my belief in Matthew priority and the early church fathers, and no, there's not enough evidence to overturn 1800 years of church teaching on it. But I also say, if you are Mark priority, make sure that if you speak on this in your Sunday school class, hopefully, I doubt you'll do it in a church service when you're preaching, but when you're speaking on this subject, make sure you don't explain it in completely humanistic terms that you totally leave out the Holy Spirit, right? Yeah. So I think sometimes we can talk about it that way.
Yeah, whatever we take, let us not forget that. It's just that they would say, yes, the Holy Spirit guided Matthew to take Mark and to take Q and put it together. Okay, I hear that, but I don't think that's a necessity.
So any thoughts on the early church fathers? Did they seem to give the implication or indication that these were four independent eyewitnesses, or did they have any indication that they borrowed from each other, or that they at least were aware of each other?
I do not recall anything in Papias and Irenaeus and Polycarp that explain a dependence. Now maybe I missed it. Augustine, how you want to pronounce his name, does not really say so-and-so borrowed from so-and-so was influenced by so-and-so. they don't say. So I think we are left to speculate on that. Luke does say that there were sources, but Luke doesn't say, I'm quoting these sources. He doesn't say
Right.
that. And he has, that he may have interviewed Mary and may have interviewed some of these people that show up in his gospel that weren't in Matthew's gospel or Mark's gospel. So he did his research, but he doesn't say, I borrowed it from this author, I borrowed it from that author. They're just silent on that.
Don't you feel like there's some pressure in academia to accept this? Have you had any? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's the dominant motif. Fortunately, at Masters University and Masters Seminary, I think we all are on the same page with Matthean priority. And that is because of a guy who graduated from Dallas Seminary, Robert Thomas, made a real impact at the seminary. And I think because of that, Matthean priority has been the dominant theme at Masters Seminary and Masters University. But I realize that at other schools, I think people just don't think through it, and say, is there an option to Markan priority, and have just accepted it without thinking through it. But when you add that quelle source, that non-existent, there's no evidence for its existent source, that's when you start to really get, maybe there's something more here that I've not examined, that Matthew's work was more than being an editor. And I think that is what shook me into rethinking this issue.
You've mentioned D.A. Carson, influence of Carson and others, and we are appreciative for him for a lot of different areas. And I love his book, Exegetical Fallacies. It's a great one. But one of his exegetical fallacies that he cites is appealing to authority. And kind of saying, well, so-and-so says this, right? D.A. Carson says, Mark priority. So that's it. We're moving on. It seems, and I'm not saying people say that, but there's enough of those D.A. Carsons that I think you're right. People aren't examining all the evidence for themselves. And
D.A. Carson believes it, and it must be okay.
And it's not something I want to devote hours and hours of hours examining the Apostolic Fathers on. Right? I'll just go and study other things, but I'll just depend on these experts on these matters. Okay, well, for pastors and Bible teachers listening today, what resources would you recommend if they want to explore Matthean priority more deeply?
Good. Yes. So some that are accessible very clearly is David Allen Black's Why Four Gospels. Nobody should be demeaning the scholarship of David Allen Black. He's a super scholar. And he has written Why Four Gospels. There's a little book that has just come out that maybe has escaped the attention of many people. And it's by a writer named Daniel Moore. It's called A Trustworthy Gospel Arguments for an Early Date for Matthew's Gospel. That I think is worth considering. And also Eta Linneman. I don't know how familiar our viewers are of Eta Linneman. Eta Linneman was schooled in German higher criticism and rejected it, and came to have a very evangelical view of the Gospels. Her little book, Is There a Synoptic Problem?, translated by Robert Yarborough, is also, now there's a person who was in German higher criticism, came to a belief in the inspiration of the Gospels, and it's a very valuable work. John Wenham, Redating Matthew, Mark, and Luke is also reprinted in 2020. Those are
he's a well-known British scholar.
He is. This is not just in America. These are British scholars as well. And if I may be permitted to say it, there are some Roman Catholic scholars, B.C. Butler and a Roman Catholic scholar named Orchard, has written on this and are very, very scholarly and give good arguments for Matthean priority.
Very good. And again, your commentary will be out in August or September?
Yes, published by Fontes Press. And if people are wondering, do you only talk about Matthean priority? No, I don't. But in the introduction, I do address this issue.
Yeah, that's a small part of the whole,
Yes.
Very small part compared to everything else, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, our time is up for today's episode, but our conversation on this subject matter is not yet finished. I'm glad to have next week Dr. David Allen Black on the podcast to discuss his book, Why Four Gospels, subtitled The Historical Origins of the Gospels, where we will investigate even further this subject of Matthew priority and the Synoptic Problem. It is sure to be another great discussion, which will build upon this one today. And if you're enjoying the Bible and Theology Matters podcast, will you do me a personal favor and like this podcast wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts or watch this podcast? Please also consider subscribing to it and sharing it with someone you know. These actions will help the Bible and Theology Matters podcast to become more accessible to those who are looking for faith-affirming programming. You can also follow our Bible and Theology Matters Instagram and Facebook pages. A special thanks to Dallas Theological Seminary, who's a sponsor of this program. If you'd like to be a student of mine and many other wonderful professors at Dallas Theological Seminary, please visit dts.edu. Until next time, never forget, Bible and theology really does matter, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.